Okay, let me share my screen. And thank you all for attending. I know life is very busy these days, even though we're not going anyplace. And I want to thank you for coming to hear this talk on new features in MySQL 8.0. As Diana said, my name is Dave Stokes. I am a community manager. You can reach me on Twitter at @Stoker. There's my email address and my blog. And let's get rolling. First thing is I'm going to be talking 99.999% of the time today about the free community edition of MySQL, which is free under the GPL version 2. There will always be such a version as long as we're around. However, during Q&A, I might venture off into some new uncharted territory of new products, stuff that has somewhat been announced, but not quite there. We're open source, so you can go out to GitHub, grab a copy of our code, and you might see some stuff that's coming down the pike that we haven't quite officially put a stock keeping unit on or a price, even though it might be free. So if I'm talking about anything that's feature-based, please take that with a grain of salt. And by the way, if you're running MySQL 5.6, it reaches end of life in February of 2021. No more updates, no more support. It's going to be a lot harder to find anyone who knows anything about it. It's very hard to find old versions. So if you have an old database you're trying to restore on an old Linux operating system, it's just a pile of headaches. So if you can, please upgrade ASAP. I believe the official date is February 5th. So please upgrade to MySQL 5.7 or better yet 8.0. A little bit of information about me. 20 some odd years ago, I was working for the American Heart Association and needed a database, and MySQL came out also about the same time as PHP came out. It's been a lot of my career for the past 2.5 decades. I had a history of working in projects where I was hired in at the last minute because they were out of budget, which meant I had to use open source software. Eventually joined the MySQL AB company as a programmer on the certification team. And I went through the MySQL AB sale to Sun Microsystems and then our sale to Oracle. Left for a little bit to go to a columnar database engine for MySQL called CalPoint. Then I joined the MySQL community team just a little bit over a decade ago. Time sure has flown. Since I was on the certification team, I have a whole bunch of old MySQL certifications. I also have the latest and greatest DBA and developer certifications. If you have questions about that, we can talk about that. And I do live in Texas with required Hound Dog and pickup. The slides for this talk are on slideshare.net/Dave Stokes, and this talk is being recorded and will be up on the Oracle site post haste. By the way, if you want to try the new MySQL database service for free, you can sign up for $300 in free credits. If you stick to the lower end virtual boxes, that will last you quite a long time. This is the enterprise edition of MySQL, so you get the big backup tools, the big monitoring tools, and all that. Oracle is claiming that we're the cheapest out there, and from my test, it's definitely like that. By the way, they do not give all the employees the McLaren cars like that, unfortunately, so do not ask to borrow mine. The agenda today. Frankly, if we started answering questions today and I answered all your questions halfway, we never got past the slide, that'd be great for me. I'm sure other folks would be unhappy. But the idea is I want to cover a bunch of material today, and I'd love to answer your questions. By the way, if you have questions, I am monitoring the question and answer panel. I'd rather answer your questions as they pop up, but I will go over them at the end too, because I hate to have you sitting there on a question and have it bubble all through the presentation and have you miss something. So we can make this as interactive as possible. So, by the way, I'd love to know what you'd like to hear from you, what you'd like to see in MySQL in the future. So when 8.0 came out in April of 2018, it was a big change in product, also a big change in delivery philosophy. In the old days, it took years to get new features into MySQL. That was slow, costly, not great for customers. So we've gone to the CI/CD bandwagon and we're releasing roughly 4 times a year. Now, the software that we release is a lot more complex back in the 5.5 era. It is out there on GitHub if you want it, and the source code is out there on dev.mysql.com/downloads. Now, most of our development has been made very modular using plugins. So we can very quickly develop something. And by the way, that also means if you don't like it, you can just uninstall the shared object, very easy to do, and don't have to worry about that. One of the examples there is by default, MySQL 8.0 runs TLS 1.3. So between the client and the server, your connection is encrypted. A lot of people don't need that. Many more people do, and it was painful to set up. So it's easier to have us just install it by default and let you turn it off if you don't need it. Also, this is a better opportunity for us to work with the various components of the new MySQL shell, and it'll be cluster, the at-rest encryption, router enterprise backup. All the components are tested together and built together, and we run tens of thousands of tests every night on the software, so it's all automated. By the way, this is a much better product. One of the things that Oracle did when they came in is they liked our database, and they said, it's great, but you have some problems here. Go out and get some talent to work on it. So we've have a whole bunch of more staff. I don't know the exact percentage, but it's at least doubled, probably tripled from the original crew when we were taken over. By the way, Oracle has a lot higher hurdles to get software out to the public than we had before. So the rigor is extraordinary for what we went for. And I think we give a much better product. By the way, the latest version of MySQL is 8.022, came out several weeks ago. We'll have a new release in, I believe, the January timeframe. So the question used to be, if you're running MySQL 5.5 and Enterprise Backup 3.2 with the Java Connector 1.8, did it all work together? Well, it may not have. Well, now it's easier. We just tell you if you're running server 8.2.2, run everything else 8.022, the connectors, router, workbench, shell. We test them together, we build them together, and we guarantee them together. So once again, we're looking at the MySQL Community Server, the free edition. And I'm actually going to work backwards in time from the latest release of MySQL 8.0 to our GA release back several years ago. Now, in October, when 8.022 came out, there was a whole bunch of changes. Every release, we have release notes, and I tend to skim them for the ones that I think are the most generally interesting to a big audience. Now, prepared statements are prepared only once. We'll go into that in a little bit of detail. File sort algorithm now supports joining on multiple tables, not just a single table. That will give you some big improvement. An alternative show process list that I'll go into detail came out. Possible to convert a timestamp column from the system time zone to a UTC. Very important, especially as people go to the cloud and they have different time zones where they're storing their data and doing replication to. And we also have a new asynchronous connection failover mechanism that I'll get into the details. So the thing about prepared statements. MySQL, when it started 25 years ago, was not a complex database. And a lot of the assumptions that were made back then over time have proven not to be the greatest. A couple of them are still out there. One of them we had was prepared statements are now only prepared once. If you're not used to prepared statements, you build kind of like a outline of your query that's going to go to the server and then plug in your variables before they go out there. Great thing about this is it really cuts down on SQL injection and some other problems that you might have. The only trouble is we're building that scaffolding every time. You don't need to do that. This should give a lot better performance for those of you who love prepared statements. Alternative show process list. Many years ago, one of the things that Oracle, that MySQL was denigrated for is we didn't have a lot of access to the various low-level counters. The granularity of checking what was going on low in the system wasn't quite there. So people started using things like show process list. Now, the trouble with show process list is it works across threads, and there's a global mutex there. Anytime you're locking someone out with a mutex, it tends to have performance consequences. There's now an alternative show process list, which is based on stuff from the performance schema process table. Performance schema is where we keep the great majority of the process information that's going on. So if you are running show process list to watch your server, you might try this. It might give you much better performance. new async connection failover mechanism. In replication, when you have a primary that goes offline for maintenance or something else, you can now specify other machines to use as primaries. In the past, if you're running NODB cluster, router and the cluster would make the decision, or I should say NODB cluster would make the decision. This speeds things up considerably if you have a bunch of potential hosts. Okay, back in July, we added a whole bunch of features that I found rather handy. User details, JSON value, redo logging, which I'll go into a lot of detail on. By the way, our Docker containers, which we write are the Mysql Docker containers, now support server restart within a client session. And group replication auto rejoin feature is now activated by default. It used to be that if you had a system that went out of the cluster, it had to be forced in there. User details. If you're a Unix admin, used to this to being the GCOS field in the etc password file. For MySQL, the big problem is you'd have someone call up and say, "Hi, I'm Bill, and I can't get into the new financials database." And you look through the MySQL.users table, and you'd find 17 people named Bill, and you're not quite sure which one it is. So you'd end up playing phone tag back and forth with this person. Well, we now have a way to add comments into the user attributes field in the MySQL.users table. So you can actually specify who is what for which account, some information about them. The accepting example you see there is they're adding an email. So if you're a longtime admin and you're thinking, oh my God, that's a godsend, that we really needed that many years ago. JSON value. We added a JSON native data type back in the 5.7 days. And what's real interesting is now that we have a lot of stuff stored in JSON, which is free format, when you try to do analytics on it using windowing functions or something like that, sometimes the free-form format of JSON bites you in the rear. JSON value is an interesting way to cast stuff into the format that you want. Now, in the example here, we're going out to the demographics and life expectancy tag and pulling back a value. Well, that value is actually something like 8.475642. It's a long real number. In this case, we're formatting into a decimal. And there's other values you can do cars, var cars, all that sort of stuff. But very handy for neatening up your SQL, your JSON data before processing it with SQL. Redo log. When you make a change with replication running on MySQL, it takes a copy of that query that you've made, either the output of it or the actual query, and puts it in the redo log. In replication, that's copied over to the replica machine, and that is used by the replica to update its copy of the data so everything stays synchronized. Well, if you're bringing a new machine online, you don't need to do that on the replica every time you run a query. You already have that data that's been replicated on the primary, so you're bringing it down. So on the replica, you turn off that redo log, and things load a lot faster. Okay, back in April, we set it up so that hash joins were used anytime a nested block loop would be employed if it made more sense. Now, I'll have some slide on that a little bit later. And with 8.0.20, we started supporting non-equi joins, inner non-equi joins, semi-joins, anti-joins, left outer joins, right outer joins. Also binary log transaction compression. I'll get into that. And we also improved our contention aware transaction scheduler algorithm. What that was several years ago, I believe it was the University of Michigan, had an academic research paper on what you do when you have hot rows or hot columns in a database. And they came up with some heuristics to figure out how to handle that. And our engineers saw that and worked with them, and it's now implemented. When the system realizes that there's hot rows, this automatically knows how to handle the greediest queries and get them out of your hair as fast as possible. Binary log transaction compression. When you're doing that replication I mentioned earlier with the redo log, you're writing out files and they can get large. So it helps if you keep them compressed. Now, the compression helps when you're saving on disk space and when you're sending it over the internet or Ethernet or whatever you're using to the replica. And the replica can read that information without having to uncompress it. So you're not wasting cycles compressing and decompressing. And also it's a smaller payload on disk and through the network. Okay, back in January of 2020, and why does that feel like ancient times? We added some features for too many login attempts, the table statement, limits and recursive common table expressions, and alias on duplicate key. I'll get into a couple of these in just a moment. One of the things we used to have with failed login attempts is that someone could hammer an account and cause some massive interruptions to your service. So what we've added is, as you can see here, we're creating a user called U1, identified by their password, failed login attempts 3. So after the third failed login attempt, the password lock time is 3 days. This account is going to be off air for 3 days. By the way, never have a database open to the internet or an exposed network where you can't control who gets in. Very, very bad practice and leads to you doing a lot of backups and restores. You can also set it up so that after X amount of attempts, the password lock time is unbounded, which means someone has to manually come in and open up this account. Tables and rows. Every database tries to uphold the SQL standard. And if you've ever read the SQL standard, it's a mess. There's some stuff that has contradictory and nebulous formulations of ideas that sometimes just don't make it out there. But one of the requests we had was for the table and row operators. Now, if you're used to doing select star from T in a query, now you can just put in table T. They are the equivalent. And in the past in MySQL, you were used to inserting data, insert into T1 values 1, 2, 3 for the first record, 4, 5, 6 for the second record. Now you can use the row keyword to achieve the same thing. Brings us closer to the standard, makes it easier for some folks to port. And alias on duplicate keys. I love foreign keys, and it used to be in the past to when you ran into a duplicate key and you wanted to give it a new key that would be different, you had to do a little bit of engineering using the values operator. Following our logic in triggers, we've gone from using values operator to just using the keyword new. Okay, last October, or actually a year ago, October, random passwords, explain, analyze, hash joins, compression added ZTSD, and the Enterprise Edition started supporting the Hashi Vault Corp along with the Oracle Data Vault. So random passwords, why is this important? Well, good password practice is kind of hard for a lot of companies to do. And with MySQL back in the 5.6, I believe, or 5 days, we set it up where you can define how complicated a password be, the length, the number of uppercase versus lowercase, control characters. You could do that. Now, creating random database passwords, have the MySQL follows what you set up for the complexity rules that you set up. And when you create a user, you can say create user foo at wildcard identified by random password, and you get a very well-formed random password returned to you. Hash joins, I mentioned this earlier. In orange, you see our standard branch and loop join that MySQL does. The idea was you read in a table and branch off and loop to the other table. Well, hash joins, you combine them all. And you see here, the blue columns are the hash joins. So you see in our first example, a little bit of performance gain, and then for the rest of these, massive performance gains. And by the way, as I mentioned earlier, in 8.0.20, we added anti-semi and outer hash joins. Explain, analyze. For those of you who aren't used to trying to prove the performance of your queries, what you do is you prepend the word explain to your query. And this will go out to the optimizer and say, hey, how are you going to solve this query? Well, traditionally, the optimizer works off historical information. It's kind of like the car's GPS, where if I want to go to my favorite restaurant, my GPS knows that I turn right at the end of the street, left at the stop sign, over the railroad tracks, and the restaurant's on the right. But being on that's based on historical information. What my GPS doesn't know, there's a train across the tracks, my neighbor flooded out the street. That way is not going to work to get there. Now, explain, analyze actually runs the query and reports the real time it's going to take to perform your query, the real actions, the real cost counts, and all that information. Very, very valuable. By the way, if you see skew between explain, analyze, and regular explain, please run analyze table to update the statistics. Okay, July 2019, we added multi-valued indexes, JSON document validation, dual password, the clone plugin, and a new collation. Multi-valued indexes. Traditionally, you have one entry in an index for one entry in a table. And with everyone throwing data into JSON arrays, that became a hindrance. So the idea was you can now create multi-value indexes, as you see here, and you can have one entry in a table generate multiple entries in an index. This pays off when you get above 5 to 20 million records in a JSON array. Very, very handy. Now, I love the JSON data type. It's very, very handy. The old-time DBA folks are going to complain because there's no way to make sure that required information is in there. There's no data type. So the equivalent of trying to shove a car value into a decimal or an integer value, the system doesn't complain about it. It lets bad data in. Now, the folks at jasonschema.org came up with a way to set up exemplar or format tables where you actually specify what you want in your JSON document, and you test your document against that exemplar. In this example, we're going to use the JSON schema valid function, and we pass it a JSON document that says we're going to expect an object. The properties of our object is that its name is called my age. It's going to be a numeric data type. The minimum allowed value is 28, and the maximum allowed value is 99. And then we also say, oh, by the way, it's required. So any JSON documents coming in that have a value between 28 and 99, it's going to be great. If they don't have that range or that data type, or don't even have that key value pair, it's rejected. Here's an example where we try to put in a value that's too low. It doesn't let the data into the database. And if we put in a value that's within parameters, away it goes. Why is this important? Well, it's a lot easier to keep bad data out than to allow bad data in and then have to go find it and clean it up. Very messy, very time consuming, and it gives you lots of gray hair. Dual passwords. When I first saw this come out, I'm going, what is that good for? Well, let's walk through an example. We have an account called Dave at deardave.xyz, and we're setting up a second password. Second password is deardave2, and we're going to return the current password. So in the Mysql at user table, you now see an additional password in the user attributes field. Well, say like we have multiple people or multiple applications using the same password, and it comes time to update that, and you're not sure that everyone's going to get the email that things changed. you can go out there and run dual passwords and slowly remind the folks that, hey, on X date, we're not going to use this password anymore. And when that date hits, you can discard the old password. Also, for those of you who work in environments where you have lots of applications where everything's hard-coded, this gives you a chance of having the possibility to do small batches of updates rather than try to do everything at once. Okay, April 2019. Mysql Upgrade script runs automatically. No chance to forget that again. I'll go into it. Constraint checks, as you saw with the JSON document validation a minute ago. The C API supporting asynchronous non-blocking communication to the server. Okay, the upgrade script. For years and years after you've done an upgrade of MySQL, the binaries, you had to run Mysql Upgrade, which was a script that would log in and change the metadata for your database. We'd add new columns, we'd change columns, delete columns. But what would happen is, since there was an extra step, a lot of folks would just skip it. And our engineers were always faced with, oh, we were running this problem and then this happened. Well, how about if we just make it automatic as part of the upgrade process? So now when you upgrade, the system restarts, it checks its metadata level and knows whether things have to be upgraded or not. Taking this step out is a big win-win. If you got Stack Overflow, you'll see legions of this information. Constraint checks. MySQL used to have constraint checks, but they weren't enforced. So you could put in all the constraint checks you want, but they just didn't work. We got it out there after a lot of requests and a lot of hard work. Now, in this example, we're going to create a table called T1. And the first check we're going to have is make sure the value for column C1 is not equal to column of C2. Second check we have is going to make sure that the C1 integer column is greater than 10 and that the C2 integer column is greater than 0. Now, notice in this example that we're naming the constraint C2 positive. If this fails, it's going to come back and say constraint check C2 positive failed. And this one fails, it's going to tell you, hey, second constraint check failed. Okay, which one is that? So you actually have to go look at the table definition instead of getting a clue here that, oh, C2 wasn't positive. Okay, January, February 2019, we added an administrative TCP IP port. So you can set the maximum connections to 0 and still have a way to get in and administer the system. We modified the JSON array aggregation and JSON object aggregation functions to work with windowing functions for analytics. This will take either JSON or non-JSON data and change it so you can use it with windowing functions. We added set persist. If I make a change on the MySQL instance on Monday, my buddy Fred does another change on Wednesday, and someone else makes a change on Thursday, and for some reason it reboots. I may not know what those other changes are, but if we prepend set persist before changing global variables, this will write it out to a little configuration file, the last thing run as the system comes up. So therefore, you don't lose those changes. You don't have to chase what other people are doing. And we also added lateral drive tables. Well, what is a lateral drive table? Well, when you write a subquery, like you see here, it's a very constrained type of query, and you're feeding that output to an outer query. Now, the outer query does not know without the lateral keyword what's inside the inner query. But with the keyword lateral added, I can now say, okay, I want to be able to reach into that query and pull out exactly what I want. Very handy for writing subqueries. I'll admit that I like common table expressions much better, but this is a handy way to write subqueries that are a little more easier to read and understand. So let's go back to 8.0.11, which was our first generally available release of it. The big changes we've had, data dictionary. In the past, if you've gone under var lib mysql, you've seen a whole bunch of little files, .frms, myi's, myds. That was the metadata. And 25 years ago when we were starting, that was a good place to keep the data. The only trouble is that it sucked up inodes. Those little files tend to attract the attention of junior admins who couldn't figure out what they were and blow them away and ruining your database. So now that data is kept within the database. The good news there is that you can now have millions of tables within a database or schema. The bad news is you can now have millions of tables within a database or schema. I haven't seen anyone get past about 23, 24 million before getting bored with it. Histograms. Histograms are an alternative to indexes. Indexes are great for going right to the record or records that you desire. However, there's overhead. Every time you do an insert, an update, or a delete, you have to update that parallel index table to the main table. Histograms are designed for data that doesn't really churn that much. It's like you literally assign things to buckets. So if you're going to have values 0 to 100, you have a bucket for 0 to 25, 26 to 50, 51 to 75, and then 75 to 100. And you're giving the optimizer a better hint of where the data is. Now, optimizers tend to think that the data is laid out in a nice, even distributed pattern. Not always true. Histograms give your optimizer a better fighting chance to give you a better query plan. Resource groups, you can now assign virtual CPUs to like a batch processing group and assign that a low priority. We've improved the Json support, added things like JSON table, which lets you take your unstructured JSON data and temporarily turn it into structured data for processing with SQL. We also have ways to take the unstructured JSON data and permanently turn it into structured SQL type columns. We've improved InnoDB cluster. I'll go into that in a little bit. I've been working on our new XDev API, so you don't have to fight SQL if you don't want to learn that programming language. Our new temporary engine is a lot faster. In the past, the temporary engine would get to X size and then realize it was running out of its limit, copy all that information over to the InnoDB tables type, and then restart. That stop, copy, restart was expensive, and we don't do that anymore. If you're using a temporary table engine, you're going to see somewhere between 10 to 20% better improvement. So overall, with 8.0, we're giving you a better SQL. We're adding a lot more features there. Also giving you a lot better NoSQL. The product is a lot more robust. You don't need to run a NoSQL database and a SQL database. You can run it all on the same platform. We've been working a lot on InnoDB cluster. The idea is your application using a MySQL connector talks to MySQL router, which can also be on your application hardware, virtual or otherwise. And that's all your application needs to know about. Doesn't need to know how many machines are in the cluster beneath it, what type they are, how they're working, all that. Your machine just needs to know talk to router. Router knows everything about the cluster. MySQL router is a lightweight level 4 proxy. There is a level 7 proxy out there if you need something more complex called Proxy SQL. Not one of our products, but I do recommend it if you do that level of complexity. If you can use a level lower level router, router's great. In this case, router is monitoring a 3-node cluster. One machine's answering all the reads, well, it's answering all the writes, and it can also participate in returning read requests. The other 2 machines are doing read requests only. If something happens to the primary here, InnoDB cluster will automatically fail over to one of these sub-second failover and promote it to a read-write machine. You can bring back the other machine as read-only if you want. No problem there. By the way, this can also be multi-primary, where you have multiple masters running at the same time. I think the limit on that is still 9 machines as of right now. Now, all this is administered by our new shell. Let me show you the new shell in just a moment. A replica set. If you set up Mysql replication in the past, it used to be kind of onerous because you'd make a backup of your primary machine, copy it over to the secondary, get both machines running, and set up the various links between the 2 machines and have to set up a file position, all that. Don't need to do that anymore. This is greatly improved with global transaction identifiers being added to replication. However, we wanted to give something that had more of the functionality of InnoDB cluster, which is you can set up a cluster in under 9 commands with the new shell. That's for 3 nodes. Replica set will do a lot of the setup for you, but it still doesn't have a manual, doesn't have an automatic switch over. You have to somehow manually switch over or fail over. This does help you set up replication much easier. And the big benefit here, also with InnoDB cluster, is that you have the clone plugin. When you bring a new machine into a replicated environment, what it does is it finds a donor machine and does a file level copy of the InnoDB table space very fast between the two machines. Amazing performance here. Much nicer than having to go out and run backups and copy it over and then undo the backup and get everything running. Also, Mysql Shell. Our old shell is 25 years old, and it's getting a little bit long in the tooth. So we wanted to start with a clean sheet. So we wanted an advanced client and code editor. It has command completion. So if you don't remember the syntax of a SQL statement, type in the first letter or two, hit tab, and it will walk you through that. The help support is extensive and very valuable. It speaks 3 variations of languages. It, of course, speaks structured query language. It also speaks Python and JavaScript. So if you have libraries you like to use with those languages and your database, you can do that. You can also save your scripts and run them later. If you remember things like my counterpart from Belgium has a lot of that. Oh, I have a question. Talk about the difference between MySQL dump and MySQL enterprise backup. I also like to mention that the Mysql Shell has a new set of backup utilities. MySQL dump basically takes all your information and serializes. Let me hit serialize. MySQL serializes all your information to a file. A MySQL enterprise backup is a little smarter, and it's how do I say this? Rather than just serialize everything into one big file, backup breaks things up in a little bit better. It also tracks a lot more information for you. Unfortunately, I don't really have a lot of the details here and brain farting badly on what the exact differences are. Enterprise backup is a wonderful tool because it has a lot of smarts built into it. Hopefully, Jeffrey, I'm answering that correctly. Also, look at the util.dump instance utility in the new shell. Great thing about enterprise backup is that it is extremely fast. MySQL dump is, since it serializes stuff, it's single threaded. It's a bit slow. Also in the new shell, as I mentioned earlier, it's our admin tool for InnoDB cluster and replica set. If you are running 5.7, there is a utility to check for anything like any potential conflicts before an upgrade to 8.0, like uses of renewed reserved words and problems with using UTF-8 MB4 with your data. Okay, also it has a bulk loader. If you are, oh, by the way, let me take a look at the new shell. As you notice, it's no longer monochromatic. We actually have information out there. The yellow here means we're talking JavaScript. I connect in to the server, and it, you see I'm logged in as root on localhost. It gives me the information here that I'm on localhost, what port I'm using, that secure sockets in there. Once again, I'd like to point out that we are using TLS version 1.3 and have encryption turned on by default. And with MySQL 8.0, by default, all the character sets and for the client and the server are going to be UTF-8 MB4. That gives you all 4 planes of the Unicode 9.0 standard, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and emojis. You can use the MySQL 8.0 as a NoSQL database. Here we've connected in. I'm going to use a schema called FolStem. I'm going to create a document collection called A. And I can do, by the way, DB is a pointer to the FOSDEM schema. db.a.add, type in a JSON document, and boom, I've added a document in 3 commands, and it's all in JSON, so it's free format. And if I do a dba.a.find, there's my information foobar. By the way, our new API, a lot of junior developers find a lot easier than trying to fight the SQL syntax. Oh, we got a question here from Andy Cohen. MySQL says lump, it should probably dump. Has the option to parallel slaves, but doesn't provide the ability to exclude option, which will a new version provide this functionality? Andy, I don't know. I will ask the engineers. By the way, if you want to talk directly to our engineers, they're at mysqlcommunity.slack.com. And let me write that down real quick. Dump. By the way, if you really want, you can, MySQL pump. I haven't used MySQL pump too much because I've been, when I have to do a dump, I either dump or use the new utility stuff. Another thing to do is go out to bugs.mysql.com and put in a feature request. The more people we have requesting features like that, Andy, the faster we get them out there. By the way, the new shell has a parallel bulk loader that I briefly mentioned. This came with 8.0.17. This will bulk load JSON, CSV, or TSV files parallel, amazingly fast. So if you are doing bulk loads, this is great. Here's login, not using SSL. I'm saying we're going to use the utility import table, put the information in a schema-tile test and to a table called foo. For 2020, we've had 4 releases. And by the way, this cartoon on the left is kind of that people would complain that MySQL runs slow and then you need a physical RAM and suddenly things run faster. For years and years, that was the main admin advice QL. Those days are gone. We're trying to make the database smarter. So when the internet and onto your hard disk and you install it, it has a better idea of what's going on. We're doing similar stuff, trying to get it so that when MySQL comes out, it recognizes exactly memory you're running, what sort of CPUs you're running. So we're trying to give you a much better product that way, but we missed some of the obvious clues, unfortunately. Every company does that. So here's a list of stuff I think you're going to start seeing in 2021, 2022. This is not endorsed by Oracle, MySQL, my bosses, or anyone else but me. If you haven't looked at the Enterprise Edition, it's been really strong on security, doing data masking, encryption, a whole bunch of other stuff. Those folks are working very hard on a lot of features that you're going to hear about shortly. If you really are super paranoid about your data, and I recommend being super paranoid on your data, please go out and look at Enterprise Edition. Sign up for the free MySQL database service and play with the security features like at-rest encryption. Also, you're going to see a lot more improvements in the JSON support. JSON has proven to be wildly popular. It does things like allow you to skip what I call searching table, index, getting stub data. You go down and find your customer's favorite color that's 4 or 5 tables down. Denormalize your data and put that into a JSON field. You have a gigabyte in that JSON column to store that information. Also, our GIS support has gotten a lot better. With 5.7, we started using the boost libraries, and with 5.7 we got a 2D world, and 8.0 we got the 3D ellipsoidal wraparound world. Our GIS functionality is amazing. You're going to see a lot more functionality in InnoDB cluster, especially working with the OCI. I mean, things like the clone plugin have made things absolutely much better for bringing on new replicas. You're going to see more features in the new shell. And number 6 there, still a few mutexes to eliminate. When you start writing code and you eliminate one problem, it tends to expose one or more other problems. So you start working down a chain of problems to try to make life better. And every time we make life better here, there's something else down there that we're pulling on. Our engineering team is doing a lot of great work getting rid of that. If you go out to planet.mysql.com, Dmitry Kravchuk writes occasionally on benchmarking, and you'll see how they literally hammer out the next problem. Also, I think we're going to see more emphasis on Kubernetes-ish deployments. Big Trouble's databases are not supposed to be ephemeral. They're supposed to be around forever. And when you have environments where you can pull up something instantaneously and take care of it, and then have it go away almost the same time, doesn't work with the concepts of a database. But you're going to see a lot more work in that area. By the way, I think DBAs are going to be harder to find, but the scope of their job is going to widen. In a lot of markets, I get requests, hey, do you know any DBAs in this market because I'm looking to hire? Also, bad data architecture will really start to be seen as a problem. If you train a dachshund really, really hard and enter it in the Kentucky Derby, it's going to come in last, mainly because it doesn't have the structure to run with the big horses. You're going to see a lot of people that start thinking they made a data warehouse and find out they have a data landfill. By the way, we have a new analytics product called Rapid in the cloud. So if you have data you want to run for analytics, but you don't want to do a whole bunch of ETL work, the optimizer realizes when you set out a analytics query and will automatically switch over to the Rapid engine to do all the processing. Let me head on. Oh. By the way, if you're really interested in the JSON data type, and why wouldn't you be, second edition of my book on MySQL and JSON, a practical programming guide, is out on Amazon. It's twice the size of the original edition. The basis of this book was I was looking at the documentation for MySQL. It didn't have a lot of simple, easy to understand examples. So I started writing my own examples, and that turned into a book. This discusses the JSON data type, the document store, how to use the bulk loader, a whole bunch of other stuff. So if you're working with MySQL and the JSON data type, I really recommend this book. It's fairly cheap, and Amazon has sales on my stuff all the time. So all that. By the way, if you work for a startup, Oracle would like to help you. This is a program that Oracle has where they give you credits. They will lend you an ear for you have questions, and they really want you to succeed. So if you're running a startup, please go out to oracle.com/startup and see if we can help you. And with that, I'd like to let you know the slides are out at slideshare.net/Dave Stokes.